in a small, cozy apartment that always smelled faintly of sweet chai and the spices from her mother's cooking. A 12-year-old girl named Anjali started her day not by opening her eyes to the light, but by opening her ears to the world. For Anjali, the world wasn't a collection of sights, but a living, breathing symphony of sounds. Her blindness wasn't a darkness. It was a different way of seeing, a way painted with vibrations and tones. The sharp, insistent chirping of the sparrow that nested outside her window was her morning alarm. The soft clinking of her mother's bangles as she moved about the kitchen was the sound of home and safety. The low, rumbling groan of the building's old water pump was a familiar voice, telling her it was time to get ready for the day. She would swing her legs out of bed, her bare feet finding the cool, familiar texture of the floor, and navigate her small room with an unerring confidence that came from knowing every squeak and dip in the wooden planks. The true heart of her world, however, waited in the living room. It was an old, second-hand upright piano, its once glossy black finish now a bit faded in places, dotted with the tiny nicks and scratches of a long life. To her family, it was a piece of furniture they had saved up for months to buy her. To Anjali, it was a friend, a confidant, and the vessel through which she could speak her own language. She would run her hands over the cool, smooth wood of its case before sitting on the slightly worn bench. Her fingers, small and nimble, would hover over the ivory keys, feeling the spaces between them as if reading a map. She didn't need sheet music, not even the raised bumps of Braille. Music, for her, was something to be heard, absorbed, and then released back into the world. Transformed by her own heart, her gift was something that had blossomed naturally, like a flower in a secret garden. She couldn't remember a time when sounds didn't arrange themselves into melodies in her mind. When she was 5, she had heard a simple lullaby her mother hummed to her baby brother, and by that evening she had picked out the tune on a small toy keyboard. Her parents at first thought it was a cute coincidence, but as the days turned into weeks, they realized their daughter possessed something extraordinary. She could hear a song on the radio just once, a catchy film song, a complex classical piece, a jingle for a new soap, and later she would sit at the piano and play it back. But she didn't just replicate it. She seemed to understand the soul of the music. She would add a gentle trill here, a lingering note there, a subtle shift in tempo that made the song her own, imbuing it with an emotion that felt raw and real. One afternoon, the radio was playing a particularly fast-paced and joyful folk song from a different part of the country. The beat was infectious, and her father was tapping his foot on the floor while her mother hummed along, her hands busy kneading dough. Anjali sat quietly on the sofa, her head tilted to one side, her expression one of intense concentration. She wasn't just hearing the melody. She was deconstructing it in her mind, feeling the rhythm in her bones, identifying the layers of instruments. When the song ended, the house fell back into its normal rhythm. But Anjali got up and walked to the piano. She sat for a moment, perfectly still, and then her fingers began to dance. The melody that emerged was the same one from the radio, but it was richer, fuller. With her left hand, she created a deep, rhythmic bass line that mimicked the drum beats, while her right hand flew through the main tune, adding little cascades of notes that sounded like ringing bells. She was playing the song, but she was also telling the story of it, the story of a harvest festival, of community, of pure, unadulterated joy. Her parents stopped what they were doing and just listened, a warm feeling of pride and wonder washing over them. They didn't just hear a talented child. They heard a voice that had been waiting for its instrument. This voice was about to be heard by a lot more people. One evening, as the family ate dinner, the old radio crackled with an advertisement. It was for the Young Virtuosos competition, a prestigious regional event for young musicians. The grand prize, the announcer's booming voice declared, was a full scholarship to the city's most famous music conservatory. The room went silent. Anjali's hands, which had been moving expertly to find the food on her plate, stopped mid-air. A conservatory. It was a dream that felt as distant and grand as the stars she had never seen. It was a place of proper teachers, of grand concert halls, of a future in music. It was also a world that was built on sight reading, on following the black dots on a page, a world she didn't belong to, Her father was the first to speak, his voice gentle but cautious. "Anjali, that is a very big competition. Many children with years of formal training will be there." He wasn't trying to discourage her, but he was a practical man, and he worried. He worried about the cost, the travel, and most of all, the heartbreak of his daughter being judged by a world that might not understand her unique gift. But her mother, ever the dreamer, had a different perspective. "But think of it," she said, her voice filled with a hopeful excitement. "Think of the teachers there. They could help you. They could teach you the things we cannot." She reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Your music is special, Beta. It comes from a place no one else can touch. Maybe it's time to let other people hear it." Anjali didn't say anything for a long time. She just listened to the sounds of her parents' breathing, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic noise. She thought of the piano in the living room, her only true audience for so long. She thought of the melodies that filled her head, begging to be set free. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, a fear of being misunderstood, of being ridiculed for being different. But underneath that fear was something stronger, a flicker of courage, a burning desire to share her world of sound. She took a deep breath and finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I want to try." The two simple words hung in the air, full of hope and the promise of a journey that was about to begin. It was a leap of faith, not just for a girl with a dream, but for a family that believed in the power of that dream. The day of the preliminary round felt different from the very beginning. The usual morning symphony of their home was replaced by a tense, quiet hum. Anjali could feel it in the way her mother moved around the kitchen, her steps slower, more deliberate. She could hear it in her father's voice as he wished her a good breakfast, the words a little too bright, a little too forced. The car ride to the city was a journey into a world of overwhelming noise. The familiar sounds of their neighborhood were swallowed by the constant roar of traffic, the impatient honking of horns, and the shrill cries of street vendors. For Anjali, who navigated the world through sound, it was like being thrown into a turbulent ocean. She kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, focusing on the steady, reassuring rhythm of her father's breathing beside her. When they finally arrived, the building itself seemed to hum with a kind of nervous energy. It was a modern structure of glass and steel, but to Anjali it was a cavern of echoes. Her father's hand was firm on her arm as they walked through the massive doors. The sound of their footsteps was immediately swallowed by the vastness of the lobby, where dozens of other children and their parents milled about. The air was thick with the scent of floor polish and 100 different perfumes. She could hear snatches of conversation, the metallic clicking of metronomes, and the distant, blurry sound of a violin being tuned. Each sound was a thread in a tapestry of anxiety, and she felt her own heart begin to beat a little faster, a frantic drum against her ribs. They were guided to a waiting area, and then it was her turn. Walking onto the stage was like stepping into another universe. The first thing she noticed was the silence. It wasn't an empty silence, but a heavy, expectant one, packed with the presence of hundreds of people. She could feel their collective gaze on her, a physical weight that made her want to shrink. The air here was cooler and carried the faint, dusty smell of old velvet curtains and aged wood. Her father led her to the center of the stage, to the waiting piano. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze before letting go. "We are right here," he whispered, his voice carrying a confidence she wished she felt. She sat on the smooth, cold bench and ran her fingers over the keys. This was her anchor. This was her language. She took a deep breath, just as her mother had taught her, and began to push the world away. She didn't hear the rustle of programs or the faint cough from the third row. She didn't feel the pressure of the judges' stares. She focused only on the music that was waiting inside her, the Chopin nocturne she had chosen. She had heard it only a few times, but it had lodged itself in her soul. To her, it wasn't just a collection of notes. It was a story of a lonely moonlit lake, of gentle ripples on the water, of a deep, quiet sadness that was somehow also beautiful when her fingers finally touched the keys. The first notes that emerged were soft and hesitant, like a question asked in the dark. She let the melody flow, her fingers finding their path not by sight but by feeling, by memory, by emotion. The music swelled, growing in confidence and passion. She wasn't thinking about the technical difficulty or the correct tempo. She was just telling the story. Her left hand created a deep, resonant bass like the still, dark water of the lake, while her right hand danced across the keys, painting the shimmering moonlight on the surface. She poured all of her nervousness, all of her hopes, and all of her love for music into every single note. The final chord hung in the air for a moment, a lingering, bittersweet sigh, before fading into silence. The silence that followed was profound. It lasted for a beat, 2 beats, 3. In that quiet void, Anjali felt a flicker of doubt. Had it been bad? Then a wave of applause broke through, but it felt polite, not passionate. It was the kind of applause you give when you don't know what else to do. She stood up and bowed, her heart sinking a little. She had given them her soul, and they had given her a courteous response. Then came the part she dreaded most, the judge's feedback. A woman's voice, kind and gentle, spoke first. "A very emotional performance," she said. "You have a deep connection to the music." A second judge, a man with a gruff voice, simply said, "Technically, we need to discuss your approach." But the feeling was there. Anjali waited, her hands clasped in front of her, for the third judge. She knew who he was. The famous concert pianist whose recordings her father sometimes played. His name was known in every household that loved music, but to her, he was just the man in the center, the one whose silence felt the heaviest dot when he finally spoke. His voice was not kind or gruff. It was cold, sharp, and dismissive, like ice cracking on a winter pond. He didn't mention her performance at all. "Let's be clear about what we are judging here," he began, his voice cutting through the quiet hall. "Music is an architectural art. It is built with precision, with structure, with a clear understanding of the composer's intentions, which are all written down on the page." He paused, and the silence felt accusatory. "You played from memory. You played by ear. What you did was not an interpretation. It was merely clever mimicry, like a parrot repeating words it doesn't understand." A collective gasp went through the audience. Anjali felt the blood rush to her face, a hot, prickling heat of shame. She could feel her legs begin to tremble. "You have no true understanding of the craft," the man continued, his voice rising slightly. "To stand on this stage and offer such a performance without the basic discipline of reading the music. It's an insult. It's an insult to the composer, it's an insult to the art form, and it is an insult to the other competitors who have spent years honing their craft properly." He finished with a final, damning statement. "This is not music. This is a trick." The words hit her like physical blows. Asterisk, a trick. An insult. A parrot? Asterisk, they echoed in her mind, drowning out everything else. The murmurs from the crowd were no longer just murmurs. They sounded like agreement, like judgment. She felt small, exposed, and foolish. All the joy she had found in music, all the beauty she had tried to create, had been twisted into something cheap and deceptive. She felt her father's hand on her shoulder, guiding her off the stage. Her legs felt like they were made of wood. She didn't cry. The shock was too great for tears. All she could do was walk, each step a reminder of the man's voice. Each step taking her further away from the one place she had ever felt truly at home. The music inside her, which had always been a vibrant, living thing, was suddenly silent. The car ride home was a journey through a heavy, suffocating silence. It wasn't the peaceful, quiet Anjali was used to, the kind filled with the gentle hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of her father's breathing. This silence was a living thing, thick with unspoken words and the sharp edges of humiliation. Anjali sat in the back seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She stared straight ahead, but she wasn't seeing the blurry shapes of streetlights passing by. She was seeing the cold, dismissive face of the judge, hearing his voice over and over again in her mind. Asterisk, a parrot. A trick. An insult? Asterisk, each word was a fresh stab, twisting the knife of shame deeper into her heart. Her parents didn't try to talk to her? Her father kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were just as white as hers. Her mother would occasionally turn in her seat, and Anjali could feel her gaze, a mixture of pity and a helpless, aching sadness that was almost as painful as the judge's words. When they got home, the familiar comfort of their small apartment felt foreign and unwelcoming. The usual evening sounds, the clatter of dishes, the gentle hum of the refrigerator seemed to be mocking her. She went straight to her room and closed the door, not even bothering to turn on the light. She sat on her bed in the darkness, the only world she had ever known, but tonight it felt like a prison. For the first time in her life, her blindness felt like a curse, a giant sign on her forehead that screamed different and less than. The judge had taken the one thing that made her feel special, her unique connection to sound, and had twisted it into something cheap and fraudulent. Days passed, and the silence in their home grew heavier. Anjali stopped going to the piano. It stood in the living room like a ghost, a reminder of her failure. Sometimes she would walk past it, and her fingers would twitch, a phantom memory of the keys. But she couldn't bring herself to touch it. The music inside her, the constant symphony of melodies that had always been her companion, was gone. There was only a vast, empty void where it used to be. She felt hollowed out like a beautiful violin whose strings had been cut. Her parents tried everything. Her mother brought her her favorite sweets, but they tasted like ash in her mouth. Her father tried to play her old favorite songs on the radio, but she would just shake her head and pull the blanket over her head. They were watching their daughter fade away, and they didn't know how to reach her. A week after the competition, her grandfather came to visit. He was a quiet man, a retired teacher with a face full of gentle wrinkles and eyes that seemed to see more than most. He didn't arrive with cheerful words or false promises. He just sat with Anjali in her silent, dark room. He didn't ask her to talk. He just sat, a steady, calming presence. After a long while, he began to speak, his voice soft and raspy, like the rustling of old paper. "You know," he said, "when I was a boy, I had a friend who was a traveler. He loved to explore the mountains. He had all the best maps, the most expensive compass. He could read the stars and chart a course with perfect precision. But one day a thick fog rolled in, so thick he couldn't see his own hands. His maps were useless. His compass just spun in circles. He was lost. Anjali remained still, but she was listening. But there was an old shepherd who lived in those mountains," her grandfather continued. "This shepherd had no maps. He couldn't read or write, but he knew those mountains. He could feel the change in the wind on his face and know a storm was coming. He could listen to the call of a specific bird and know where the water was. He could smell the damp earth and know which way was down. He found your friend, led him safely home, not by looking at a map, but by feeling the world around him." He paused, letting the story settle in the quiet room. "That judge on the stage," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "he is the man with the map. He has studied the charts, he knows the rules, he can follow the path that someone else has drawn for him. But you, my child, you are the shepherd. You don't need a map. You feel the music. You feel the joy, the sadness, the anger in the notes. You don't just follow a path. You create your own. Who is to say which way is truer?" His words didn't magically fix everything. The pain was still there, a dull, persistent ache. But they planted a seed in the barren soil of her heart. A tiny green sprout of an idea. What if he was right? What if her way wasn't a lesser way, but just a different way? A more honest way? That night, for the first time in a week, Anjali walked out of her room and stood before the piano. She didn't sit down. She just ran her hand along the cool, smooth wood. She remembered the judge's cruel face, the smirk on his lips. A new feeling began to bubble up inside her, pushing past the shame. It was a hot, flickering feeling. It was anger. And underneath the anger, something stronger began to glow. It was defiance. She would not let him take her music from her. She would not let him define her. She decided she would go to the final round. But she would not play a pretty, sad song. She would play something that would show them all. She spent the next few days listening to recordings, not with the innocent wonder of a student, but with the fierce focus of a warrior preparing for battle. She finally found it, a piece of music that was as complex and fiery as her own feelings. It was a whirlwind of crashing notes and delicate, ringing melodies, a story of a struggle that ends in a triumphant victory. It was perfect. She didn't try to play it at first. She just listened. She closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. She imagined the thundering octaves were her shouting back at the judge, her anger given a voice. She imagined the delicate bell-like notes were her own spirit, fragile but refusing to be broken. She let the music become her own story. She was no longer trying to mimic what she heard. She was using it to speak her own truth. Finally, she sat down at the piano. Her fingers found the keys not with hesitation, but with a new sense of purpose. She began to play, not perfectly, but with a raw, untamed power. She was forging a new voice, a voice born from ridicule and nurtured by defiance. And it was the most beautiful sound she had ever made. The night of the finals felt different. The air in their small apartment wasn't thick with the same nervous energy as before. It was calm, filled with a quiet, steady resolve. Anjali sat by the window, not looking out, but listening. She listened to the familiar rhythm of her neighborhood, the distant laughter of children playing, the evening call to prayer from a nearby mosque, the soft rumble of a late-night bus. These sounds, which once felt like a chaotic jumble, now seemed to be part of a larger, peaceful harmony. She was no longer fighting the world. She was a part of it. Her father came and sat beside her, not saying a word, just placing a warm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. In that simple gesture, she felt all the love and support she needed. Her mother hummed a soft tune as she worked in the kitchen, a melody that was less a song and more a constant, gentle prayer for her daughter. Anjali had spent the last few days not practicing frantically, but listening. She had let the Liszt piece settle deep within her, not as a challenge to be conquered, but as a story to be told. It was a story of defiance, of struggle, and of a spirit that could not be broken. The drive to the concert hall was quiet. The city's roar seemed to fade into the background, a distant hum that Anjali barely registered. She was inside her own head, in a world of sound and emotion, preparing to let it all out. When they arrived, the atmosphere was electric. The buzz of hundreds of excited voices, the scent of expensive perfume and formal wear, the echo of footsteps on the marble floor, it was all there, but it didn't intimidate her. She felt a sense of purpose, a clear vision of what she needed to do. Backstage, the air was thick with tension. Other contestants were huddled with their parents, some whispering last-minute advice, others nervously running their fingers over invisible keys. The sounds of scales and arpeggios, played with cold, mechanical precision, drifted from behind closed doors. Anjali found a quiet corner and simply stood still, her hands relaxed at her sides. She wasn't there to compete with them. She was there to share a piece of her soul. Then her name was called. A hush fell over the backstage area. Her father walked her to the edge of the stage, his grip on her arm firm and steady. "We are here," he said, his voice a low anchor in the sea of noise. "Just play your music." She nodded, took a deep breath, and walked out onto the stage alone. This time, her steps were sure and measured. She didn't feel the weight of the crowd's gaze. She felt their anticipation, a collective holding of breath. She walked to the grand piano, its polished surface gleaming under the hot lights, and sat on the bench. She ran her fingers over the keys, a silent greeting to an old friend. The silence in the hall was absolute. It was a different kind of silence from the preliminary round. It wasn't empty or judgmental. It was full, heavy with expectation, and then she began to play. The first notes of Liszt's La Campanella shattered the silence like tiny crystal bells. The famous Little Bell theme, clear and piercing, rang out. But it wasn't just a pretty sound. It was a voice. A single, clear voice calling out in the darkness, full of hope and a hint of loneliness. The audience leaned in, captivated. From the judging panel, the famous pianist watched, his arms crossed, his expression still one of skeptical curiosity. But as Anjali's fingers began to move, his posture subtly shifted. Her playing was not just technically brilliant. It was alive. The fast, intricate passages weren't a blur of notes. Each one had a purpose, a feeling. It was a torrent of emotion, a release of all the pain, the humiliation, and the anger she had kept bottled up inside since that day. Her fingers flew across the keys with a speed and agility that seemed impossible, but it wasn't just a display of skill. It was a storm, a tempest of defiance. Her body swayed with the music, her eyes closed, her face a canvas of raw emotion. She wasn't reading notes. She was living them. She was channeling the memory of the pianist's cruel words, transforming them from weapons of shame into fuel for her fire. The delicate bell-like notes returned throughout the piece, but now they sounded different. They were no longer just a lonely call. They were acts of rebellion, little sparks of light in the midst of a raging storm, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, beauty and hope could survive. The music swelled, becoming more and more intense, a powerful roar of a spirit that refused to be broken. The complex harmonies and thundering octaves were not just noise. They were the sound of a heart fighting back, a soul claiming its own voice. In the audience, people were mesmerized. They forgot they were at a competition. They forgot about technique and rules. They were caught up in the story she was telling, a story of struggle and ultimate triumph that needed no words. A young woman in the third row had tears streaming down her face. An old man, a music teacher for over 50 years, shook his head in disbelief, a slow smile spreading across his lips. On the judging panel, the famous pianist's arms had uncrossed. He was leaning forward, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes wide with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The condescending smirk was gone, replaced by a look of dawning awe. He was listening, truly listening, for what felt like the first time in his life. He was hearing not the notes on the page, but the heart behind them. When she struck the final, triumphant chord, the sound seemed to hang in the air, vibrating through the entire hall. And then there was silence. A profound, breathtaking silence that stretched for what felt like an eternity. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the music was still echoing in their hearts, and no one wanted to be the first to break the spell. Anjali sat at the piano, her chest heaving, her hands resting on the keys, completely spent. She had given them everything. Then, a single person in the front row stood up and began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap at first, but then it was joined by another, and then all at once the entire hall erupted. The sound was deafening, a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated emotion. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar of validation, of understanding, of shared humanity. People were on their feet, their faces glowing with admiration and emotion. The applause was so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Anjali slowly stood up and turned towards the sound, her face pale but serene. She bowed her head, not as a performer accepting praise, but as a storyteller who had been heard. On the stage, the judges were on their feet. The two other judges were clapping enthusiastically, their faces beaming, but all eyes were on the famous pianist. He was standing too, clapping with a fierce intensity, his eyes fixed on the small girl on the stage. His face was a mask of shock and humility, the arrogance completely stripped away, replaced by a profound respect. The roar of the crowd continued, washing over Anjali, a wave of sound that was no longer overwhelming, but a warm, embracing blanket of acceptance. As she walked off the stage, her father and mother were there to meet her, their faces wet with tears. They didn't need to say anything. Their embrace said it all. She had walked into that hall as a girl who had been ridiculed, and she was leaving as a musician who had touched the very soul of everyone who had listened. The roar of the crowd was a physical thing, a warm, vibrating blanket that wrapped around Anjali as her father led her off the stage. Backstage, the noise was a chaotic mix of congratulations, hushed whispers, and the rustle of programs. Her mother was there immediately, pulling her into an embrace that smelled of jasmine and tears. Anjali could feel her mother's body trembling with a mixture of pride and relief. Her father stood beside them, his hand resting firmly on her head, a silent, steady presence in the storm of emotion. Anjali felt drained, as if she had poured every drop of herself into the piano. But beneath the exhaustion was a quiet, glowing ember of peace. She had spoken her truth, and for a few precious minutes, the whole world had stopped to listen. The other contestants looked at her differently now. There was no envy in their eyes, only a kind of awestruck respect. A few of them came over to her, not with words, but with gentle touches on her arm, gestures that said more than any compliment could. Anjali just nodded, a small, tired smile on her face. She was not thinking about winning or losing. She was thinking about the silence that had followed her last note. A silence so full and profound it felt like the music was still there, hanging in the air, invisible but alive. Soon, it was time for the final announcement. Anjali and her parents were led to the front of the stage, just off to the side. She could hear the shuffling of the audience settling back into their seats, the expectant hush that fell over the hall. The head judge, a kind-faced elderly man, walked to the microphone. He cleared his throat, and his voice, when it came through the speakers, was filled with a strange emotion, a mix of wonder and reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice slightly trembling, "in all my years of presiding over this competition, I have never witnessed an evening like tonight." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We have a set of rules. We have criteria for technique, for interpretation, for stage presence. But sometimes a performance comes along that transcends all of that. A performance that is not just heard, but felt. A performance that reminds us why we fell in love with music in the first place." He looked out into the audience, then towards the stage where Anjali stood. "To follow the standard procedure of announcing second and third place feels inadequate. It feels like trying to measure the ocean with a ruler." He took a deep breath. "Therefore, the judges have reached an unanimous and unprecedented decision. There is no contest tonight. There's only one story to be told, one voice that we will all remember. The grand scholarship and all the honors of this competition go to Anjali." The hall erupted again, but this time the applause was different. It was more personal, more intimate. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Anjali's father squeezed her shoulder, and she felt her mother's tears on her cheek. She was guided back to the center of the stage, to the microphone. The heavy, golden medal was placed around her neck, its cool metal a strange and heavy weight. She didn't know what to say. How could she put into words the journey that had brought her here? So she simply bowed, a deep, respectful bow from the heart, and let the music of the crowd wash over her dot after the ceremony. There was a small reception for the contestants and judges in a large hall next door. The air was filled with the smell of fresh fruit juice and the sweet, buttery scent of pastries. For Anjali, it was a confusing maze of sounds, dozens of conversations happening at once. The clinking of glasses, the soft instrumental music playing in the background. She held tightly to her father's arm, her mother walking protectively on her other side. People kept coming up to them, offering their congratulations. Their voices were a blur of kind words, but Anjali just smiled and nodded, feeling overwhelmed and eager to go home, and then a different kind of hush fell over the crowd around them. The chatter quieted down, and Anjali felt a shift in the energy. She heard a familiar voice, a voice that had haunted her nightmares for days. It was the famous Pianist. She felt her parents tense up beside her, her father's arm becoming rigid under her hand. "Excuse me," the voice said, much softer than she remembered it. May I speak with your daughter?" There was a moment of silence. Anjali's father looked at her mother, a silent question passing between them. Anjali took a small breath and nodded. Her father relaxed his grip, and she felt the pianist's presence in front of her. He was close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne. "Anjali," he began, and his voice was not cold or sharp. It was humble, filled with a hesitation she had never thought him capable of. "I do not know if you can ever forgive me for what I said to you. It was cruel, arrogant, and it was wrong." He paused, and she could hear him take a shaky breath. "I have spent my entire life looking at music," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I have studied the dots on the page, the architecture of the score, the technical perfection of every note. I thought that was all there was. I thought that was what made a musician. But tonight, Tonight you taught me something I never knew. You taught me how to truly hear it." Anjali stood perfectly still, listening. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, a raw, painful honesty. "What you do is not a trick," he said, his voice now barely a whisper. "It is a gift. A gift that comes from a place most of us have forgotten how to access. You don't just play the piano, you speak with it. And I am so sorry for not listening sooner." He was quiet for a long moment. "The scholarship you have won. It is my family that sponsors it. I want you to know that we will provide you with whatever you need. The best teachers, the best resources. Not because you deserve it, but because we need to learn from you." Anjali didn't know what to say. The anger and hurt she had carried for so long were still there, but they were now mixed with a strange sense of pity for this man, who had everything but had been deaf to the most important part of his own art. She lifted her head slightly in his direction. "Thank you for listening," she said, her voice quiet but clear. It was not an acceptance of his apology, nor was it a rejection. It was a simple statement of fact. It was all she had to offer. The pianist seemed to understand. He gave a small, respectful nod and then stepped back, disappearing into the crowd. The tension was broken. Anjali felt her mother's arm wrap around her as she leaned her head on her shoulder, suddenly feeling very tired. Later, as they drove home through the quiet, sleeping city, the metal felt heavy in her lap. The streetlights cast fleeting shadows across her face. She thought about the pianist's words, about the look of shock on his face, about the profound silence after her performance. Her father reached over from the driver's seat and took her hand. "He was a proud man, Beta," he said softly, "but it takes a bigger man to admit he was wrong." Anjali looked out the window, but she wasn't seeing the passing buildings. She was seeing the world in her own way, a world of sound and feeling. The pianist's cruel words had tried to put her in a box, to define her by her limitations. But her music had broken that box wide open. She was not a blind girl who played the piano. She was a musician, and that was all that mattered. The music inside her, which had been silent for so long, was quiet now, but she knew it was resting, gathering its strength, ready to speak again when she called upon it. And she knew, with a certainty that filled her entire being, that it had many more stories to tell.